Thanks. Yeah, well, I'm always delighted when I see somebody calling the top of the market, but it has happened many times in the last 5 years. So I guess it would be good to hear from Danny why he thinks this time is different in maybe in a bit more detail. I think he's right, though, that Brexit does fundamentally change the sort of rules of, potentially fundamentally change the demand side of the equation because of the reason he said that certainly London and the southeast can no longer be such an attractive speculative land in London and the southeast cannot be as attractive as it was as a sort of global hedge for investors with universally low interest rates and negative yields on government bonds and various other traditionally safe assets. London and the southeast became almost a sort of gold, kind of gold commodity land in those places. But there is also a lot of domestic demand for property in London and the southeast from people who would like to get on the housing ladder and can't. So if there's a trickle-down effect, and there has been big falls at the top of the market, I suppose the question is whether the fall in the sort of more middle market just gets eaten up by those people who are unable to afford homes, and that sort of props things up. So it'd be good to hear what Danny thinks about that.
Okay. My preference, all I'm saying at the moment is house prices have fallen, transactions have really fallen. My preference would be for there not to be a crash next month or next year. Because the danger of a crash is it's dramatic, it crashes down, there's a fire sale, people with money buy at the absolute bottom and do well out of it, and then we do bound up again. My preference is that things are done to soften it so that we begin to get 1 to 5% falls a year, and it happens another year. People begin to get it in their head that that is what is going to happen. But at the moment, people are told there'll only be a 1% fall next year. Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors tell that everybody who tells you all have a massive vested interest in telling it to you. And they may stoke up the conditions in which it is larger. There was a similar event to what happened in '89. In '89, September, you lost double mortgage interest tax relief. You, a couple, could both get this tax relief. People jumped in to buy to get this tiny amount of money and then bought property worth far less than they paid for it and got negative equity, which is something we've forgotten about. This happened for landlords, I think, before April. So there's a little trigger, and some people bought because they didn't have to pay the higher stamp duty that came in for landlords. But the biggie is Brexit. And it isn't just the falling value of the pound. The other is the pledge to reduce migration to the tens of thousands. And stop overseas students coming. If you're really trying to warn people about a reduction in the demand for housing, those kind of pledges have an effect. But much more important than those is what happens to your economy. If we get a recession because of the Brexit vote and people are nervous, then they will delay purchasing, landlords will delay purchasing, first-time buyers delay purchasing. Once the delay begins and gets stronger, once you get it in your head that prices are falling, it really makes sense delaying further. Otherwise, you are going to lose a lot of money if you buy 1 month rather than the next. And this is so different from '89. In '89, we were talking about people having £3,000, £5,000, maybe £10,000 negative equity. You buy that £1 million, 2-bedroom, tiny cottage in Jericho, and it's worth 800,000 a year later, as it moves towards a realistic price. And suddenly, your negative equity is £200,000 less that deposit you happen to have, which you've also lost. Just as people have made money in this town, far more than they could ever have earned in the last few years, young people in the top 20% of society could potentially lose more money than they could ever earn in the next few years. And it's very dangerous.
And I would just sort of add, I think it's I think whether or not we are on the brink of a massive housing crash, it could be useful to talk about the risk of that, because, and it's certainly recognised by the Bank of England, for example, that the demand from buy-to-let landlords is extremely, it builds up sort of systemic risk for us, because when they pull out in one big go. And so talking about that risk helps us to be able to present more radical ideas and have them listened to. That's something we've been talking about for a while, isn't it, Josh?
Yeah.
Okay, so put your hands up if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. We'll take 3 comments in a row as we did last time. So there's Sarah at the back, and there's a man in orange here, and there's 2 guys with glasses at the back. So let's take all 4 of you, because you won't know who I'm talking about. So start with Sarah.
I'm going to stand up and shout because this doesn't actually amplify your voice. It's just for the recording. So, yeah. I wanted to ask about the interaction, and it was kind of like in relation to a comment I made this morning and kind of off the back of some of the questions you asked, Josh, about the usage of land and how... what other policies would you need on top of land value tax to prevent it just replicating the imbalances in our economy, essentially, as well? And I guess it kind of relates to to that map we just saw, and how, if we lose our financial passporting rights, will we have all of a sudden a massive correction in where is judged to be the most productive land in our country? Because at the moment, the reason it's so one of the big reasons it's so concentrated in London is because of the concentration of the financial sector and the dominance of the financial sector. So yeah. Yeah, so this is the reason why so many banks are located in London, is because the things like derivative contracts are based under EU law at the moment. So at the moment we're allowed to do things like deal in derivatives that are backed by euros, but leaving the EU could change all that. And it's going to be a big part of negotiations, so we may still be able to hang on to them. But the way things are looking, we very may well not. So that could really dramatically impact on, where money is made in our country.
Thanks, Sarah. Can we get the mic to this gentleman at the front in orange?
Yeah, thanks. In terms of where the risk lies, most of this weekend's been talking about the people who are the most least able to find homes for themselves. So in some respects, if there's a great crash in the housing market, maybe we shouldn't be shedding too many tears, other than possibly for those people who are tenants of buy-to-let landlords who are evicted. And I think the statistics are such that the rise in evictions is greatest in that area. You might like to comment on that.
Should we go? Yeah, you just put your hand a bit higher so that Andy can see you, and let's take the one as a third, and then the gentleman right behind him we could take as a fourth.
Thank you. I'm treasurer of Soma Housing Co-op, which is a non-profit making organisation to help disabled and disadvantaged people. We spent a number of years trying to get business ready. Does this mean that we're going to find it more difficult to borrow money to build? If the collapse happens, that I'm saying. Any observations on that?
Okay, great. So we had a question about what other policies we need on top of a land value tax in order to prevent the same sort of imbalances replicating in the economy. If I've summarised that okay. We got one about whether we should really cry for the losers of asset prices following a house price crash, or celebrate the wins for those without chance of getting on the housing ladder, and about lending for businesses following a big crash and how that might be affected. So who would like to go first out of you two on those?
I can talk on the land value.
Yep.
Yeah, so just on the land value tax, I'm not quite sure which imbalances you're alluding to, Sarah, but I think the main reason for having a land value tax would be that it would rebalance the economy, because essentially you would see those areas of the economy, those geographical areas of the country rather, where there is most economic activity, would effectively be taxed more, because land value increases would be higher, in the southeast and London, and so it would be a redistributive tax from actually the richer parts of the country with higher land values to the poorer parts of the country.
Can I just jump in there? Because
Yeah.
possibly what Sarah was alluding to is the fact that a land value tax would hit Londoners really hard. We already have social cleansing going on in London. We already have renters being pushed out and out and out. So a high land value tax in London would mean that low-income homeowners could face the same social cleansing pressures as low-income renters do now. Is that?
So just to be clear, the sort of tax I'm talking about would be a tax on the change in the value of the land on an annual basis. So it would hit those parts of a city, which are the most desirable places to locate, banks, for example. But Beth's right, and that there would be losers from any new tax. There are winners and losers, and you would have to be very careful about ensuring that those people who are, equity rich but income poor, who have very large mortgages, don't get hit excessively hard. And I think the best way to do that would be to introduce it very gradually. So start off with 0.5%, per year. At the same time as you're reducing other taxes, you're reducing income tax, or you're reducing potentially corporation tax, particularly for smaller businesses.
Ireland introduced a property value tax about 2.5 years ago. It was made to do it by the EU. It registered all its property within about 9 months. It's often said that we can't do these things in Britain because the land registry's only got halfway through, and then we talked about privatising it. But you can very, very quickly actually register all the property. The tax came in at, I think, about 0.8%, 1% if your property was worth over €1 million. It was a progressive property value tax, not on the uplift, but actually on the money. But it came in because it had to come in. And the most likely way in which we would get this kind of tax is if we simply had to find a way of raising more money. So again, it's worth talking about, because the exact form you get then matters. But new taxes tend to come in emergencies. They come in during wartime, and you've got to pay for war. That's where. You're right, the majority of people who are now homeless are people who are being evicted from private renting because they can't pay the rent that's being increased. When the housing crash happened in Dublin, it was buy-to-let landlords who had a fire sale and simply had to get rid of their property. Almost anybody, until recently, any of you can become a buy-to-let landlord if you can show a £20,000 a year income from your rent. It's not the same checks that are done on most people. So it's a very, very dodgy process. But I would just emphasise, it is really good if the tide is beginning to turn. The immediate thing is, and it's my fault for saying it, I only showed you a map showing just £4 billion worth of losses. It's absolutely nothing. The point is, it's carried on. The prices haven't gone up. The transactions have not increased. House prices in England are falling. Transactions are slowing. And the newspapers and the telly is not telling you this. Because there is such a wish from people in positions of power that the house that they own, which is worth 1.8 million, they really hope it'll be worth 2.8 million when they retire. And then they can give their immediate family some cash and have a nice retirement. And they've been banking on it. And it is worth just questioning. You can check for yourself. If you are living somewhere which has a mortgage, how many people here have got a mortgage? It almost will work by age. So this is really age discrimination largely. But okay, higher, go on, don't be ashamed, put it up so they can see who you are. Right, let's get them. No. Okay. How many own outright? How many have paid off a mortgage? There we go, there's the real. Okay. Now you lot will really know. Through your letterbox, you'll be getting from estate agents those letters saying, have you thought of putting it on the market? You'll have got a lot more recently because they've got time on their hands. Because they really want more put on. And you immediately think about crash, but just saying something has changed, partly because of Brexit, partly because it just couldn't go any higher after a certain point. You're completely right about calling it too often. I've been quiet for the last 9 years. I did call it, about 7 years ago, Danny Blanchflower, who was on the Monetary Policy Committee, called it. And 7 years ago, he said that our housing was 30% overvalued. And then it just went up and up and up. But he was right, it was 30% overvalued. It really isn't worth this. From the cost of actually the bricks, the builders rebuilding it. And we're such a long way away from that, that the next question people ask when you say the prices are going down, the transactions are going down, the next thing they ask is they say, when will it stop? And there's two things. One is, if politicians work very hard to stop it from stopping, then it will stop. Otherwise, you head down eventually to the basic value of land, which you only get if you've got a land value tax to make it true, and the actual costs of building and replacing that property.
I'm not sure if we answered two of the questions there. I mean, there was one which was about, one which was about how would lending for the productive sectors of the economy be affected if we had a house price crash? Josh, you can definitely say something on that. And the other one was about, well, should we really mourn a house price crash, since it might be great for many people in the population? And I would say something about that if you don't.
Yeah, so just on the lending problem, I mean, it is a really serious problem. And part of the reason, I mean, Danny's sort of suggesting that, you know, the corporate elite, you know, doesn't want to see a housing crash because of the vested interest, and that's definitely true. But it's also the case, I think, that people at the Bank of England and in the Treasury know that our banking sector, you know, is entirely collateralized up to the hilt in real estate. Many SME loans are made against, you know, collateral, the director's own home. So if there is a general fall in land value, in real estate prices across the economy, it will affect real economy lending, absolutely irrelevant of the fall in consumption that Danny was alluding to in a generalized recession. The banks will be faced with a situation where their assets are collapsing much more rapidly than, you know, profits they're getting from interest. And they'll either just hike up the interest they make on loans, or they'll simply stop making loans completely, and then we will be in a very serious situation. So any fall has to be managed very gently. The way around that is that we just need different kinds of banks. You know, let's set up a huge public investment bank that's focused on building houses, and particularly if they refuse to change the public debt rules, just have that off the government's balance sheet. It's a non-public corporation, but it would be focused on home building. I mean, one of the reasons we shouldn't leave the EU is because the European Investment Bank, or the European Bank of Construction, I can't remember which one it is now, is one of the largest builders of homes in this country through EU investment money. And as I said, different kinds of banks focused on business lending and not always needing to collateralize their loans against land.
Okay, well, let's move on. Okay, so more hands. Okay, great. We've got four women, 3 on the front row and 1 in the grey jumper in the middle. Well, since the one in the middle is closest to you, do you want to put your hand a bit high, up again? We'll go, and then go for it.
I think in debates like this, it's really easy to get bogged down in the detail, and I'm understanding some of what you're saying, but not all of it. But I have property. I want you to tell me, what is the thing I should do for the greater good? Just give me it in simple terms, because that's what I want to do. I'm really willing to do that and set some sort of precedent. What do I do? Just give me the 2 lines. That's what I want.
Amelia at the front there.
So you've set out this situation, whether it's happening now or at some point in the future, of house prices going down, and there's a potential that that might lead to some crisis situation. What do we need to do now, whether it's going to be in 9 months or in 5 years or whatever? What do we need to do so that when that crisis happens, the things that happen next are the most helpful? Because I imagine that the response to such a crisis could lead us to a longer-term, even worse situation, or could lead us to a longer-term, better situation. How do we get into a position where the politicians are listening or understand things in a way that's useful?
Okay,
Can we just, because we're actually running out of time, so I think it'd be nice to get in these last...
Okay, this is a very short question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And there was a guy at the back that I completely forgot about who had his hand up at the last round. So we'll get you in as well, don't worry. Go for it.
Okay, very short question. I just wondered why you thought the Royal Bank of Scotland should be divided up into 150 or whatever it was branches. Why that? How would that work? Could that model be applied to any other bank?
Mine's a question about the local situation, where South Oxfordshire has put up a bid to build 3,000 new homes on the boundary of Oxford. This is a city which has a completely finite public transport system.
And this one is going to be the last question, I think. Is that fair, Andy?
Yeah, just really briefly. It's a case. Yeah, it's a case of when, not if. And I don't see how it can't be a crash, because the same upward cycle is reversed, and fear always outweighs greed. Just one very quick technical question. Does it have any relation, how would it relate to tax havens, the land tax? Because if you start taxing land rather than corporate and personal income, you can hide income, but you can't hide land. I don't know, just off the top of my head, how would that work? But the big thing about what to do, I think the clear thing, obviously you have to learn from history. And Danny mentioned this south of Europe, Spain in particular. And, we need to learn from what's been going on in Spain, how movements that started, solidarity movements that started with resistance of evictions, have actually ended up with these people in power in the biggest cities in Spain. And I would love to see that the lady who was in my group from Salisbury, Aylesbury, as the mayor of Aylesbury, and I think go home and prepare for government, definitely. Because, as Danny says, everything changes, and that means politically everything changes. And we need to talk about everything in the discussions. That's the council, we can be the council. We need to think about how do we become the council.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think we've got about 5 minutes, Andy. Great. Okay, so who would like to go first on answering any of those 5 questions or responding?
I'll go first, because then I won't look so bad if I fail to do them. I've just explained that trick. What to do if you've got property depends how much you have got. Sorry? Okay, what to do if you've got property depends how much you have got. But some of the happiest people I have met have done interesting things with their property, often involving having other people there and slowly changing the ownership of it. There's one nice group I know on the edge of Swindon who turned a farm into a kind of cooperative thing over 30 years. So there are many things you can do, and there'll be people in this room who will have ideas if you've got property. Over what to do immediately, explaining that short-hold assured tenancies are wrong and evil, we didn't always have them, and they could be changed by an Act of Parliament, so you can't be evicted with 2 months' notice, would be very good. The other thing to be optimistic about this is, if this process begins, and this is just of falling house prices, rising evictions, people finding it harder to get by, average people in the middle of society, and also people at the top of the society not buying that tiny house for a fortune because they don't want that negative equity, and then they've got to rent and lose money to a landlord, and that annoys them. If this begins, you can even expect the Conservative Party to begin to behave in slightly different and nicer ways, because they just have to. And the Conservative Party did this in the 1950s when they built more council housing than Labour did, because the demand was so high. I don't think you should think that just because they're in power, nothing good could happen, because it depends on events and you're forced to react to events. So Philip Hammond has got rid of Help to Buy, because it became obvious it wasn't sensible. He just did it quietly because he didn't want to embarrass George Osborne too much. And then the case of what happened in Spain and what's happened in Greece. The Labour government in 2009 took away half the regional aid budget and put it into what's called the mortgage rescue package in the southeast to stop our house prices falling in 2009, before the coalition took power in 2010, because this country is so mortgaged to the hilt on property that they were worried about it. But this kind of thing can galvanise people to be more political, but it will galvanise them in both ways. Somebody who's worked at a quite hard job all their life in Essex, managed to get something for 200,000 that's now worth $1 million, is going to be furious that the thing they've worked for all their life is decreasing in value. And that could easily swing them to UKIP. Somehow somebody will convince people that it's the immigrants not coming that's the problem, but it's still the immigrants. You know, it's still the immigrants that made it worse for them, even though they're not coming. And it will move people towards that kind of politics. But the idea that you cannot look after your family on your own, this is the really interesting thing. While house prices were rising, for the top 40% of society, you could have no such thing as society. You could buy property, often just one. You could give your grandchildren a deposit just enough to let them get in. And as long as you worked like a mini socialist collective amongst the uncles and aunts and grandparents, you could get by. That way of getting by doesn't work when the speculation ends. And the top 30, 40% of society by income and wealth tend to decide what happens. It's when the top 30% could no longer pay for private schools that they got really angry about the 11 plus, because when their child failed the 11 plus, they had to send them to a secondary modern. That's why we got comprehensive schools. It was the middle class that wanted it. It was when the middle class couldn't pay for the private doctor in the 1930s that we got the campaign to have a national free health service. It wasn't the poor that got it. It was people in the better off part of society who couldn't afford to pay the private doctor anymore. And we're heading towards a situation where the children of the middle class cannot house themselves. You've seen it before for education in the 70s and 60s. You've seen it for health in the 1930s. It is entirely possible. Those two things that happened in health and education were utopian. Now, if you'd said to people 20 years earlier, we'll educate most of our children together, or if you said we'll have healthcare provided free at the point of delivery, they'd have said you're mad. What it took was the middle class needing it. And we're heading towards that situation again, but what we need is a solution that doesn't just mean that the middle class are okay. It needs a solution that actually works for everybody. I can give you an early example, gone really quick. Cholera. Cholera, 1850s, came to Oxford. And some nice medics managed to convince the middle class that cholera was a real risk to them. It actually wasn't. But as long as the middle class thought it was, they agreed for sewers and everything else to go in. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll try and answer that question about RBS from the front here. The reason the Royal Bank of Scotland is a good choice for nationalising and breaking up into 130 regional local banks is because we own it. It's already effectively a national bank. We own 73% of it. And because it is in deep trouble, it is continually getting fined millions and millions of pounds for essentially shafting SMEs and various other kinds of customers. But I would also advocate something similar for Lloyds. And essentially, I think the banking model that we have is a bit like the housing model. Actually, it's a monopolistic or oligopolistic industry dominated by one type of, it's a monoculture driven by shareholder-owned banks looking for short-term quarterly returns, not looking for long-term productive investment. Just on the broader point about what the hell are we going to do if there is a crash, one of the things that we've been talking about with Beth and others at the New Economics Foundation is whether it would be possible to separate out like the ownership of land from the place where you're living. So if there is a big crash and people fall into negative equity, could the state take on the equity in the home and in the land underneath them, but allow them to carry on living there,
owning their own home,
and owning, having a secure right to that property, so they didn't, they carried on having the security that we all value so much. But the land itself would be held collectively, and the state could have much greater control over how land was used, whether it was used to house for affordable housing, whether it was used to support investment, whether it was used for infrastructure. I think I'll leave it there. I think we're running out of time.
All right, brilliant. I think we should thank Danny and Josh. That was really interesting, provocative discussion. I really enjoyed it. And we have a break now, Andy?
Yeah, break till 4 p.m. There's fresh cake just come out of the oven downstairs.